In May 1939, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania were sovereign and independent nations. In August, well, not so much. So what happened to them? How was the occupation and how did they free themselves from the Soviet Union? Well, you can find out here today in this video the Soviet occupation of the Baltic states. In the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact signed between the Soviet Union and Germany on August 23, 1939, Latvia and Estonia were in the Soviet sphere of influence while Lithuania was in the German sphere of influence. During the invasion of Poland, Germany and the Soviet Union traded territories. This resulted in all three Baltic states falling within the Soviet sphere of influence apart from the already annexed territory of Memel in Lithuania. As early as September 24, 1939, before Poland had been taken, the Soviet Union began asserting pressure on Estonia, demanding bases for the Soviet military to establish bases. However, it was well known that this was a thinly veiled attempt by the Soviets to occupy it. Estonia. Similar pressures were placed on Latvia and Lithuania in early October. By creating political instability and unrest through these demands, the Soviet Union successfully toppled some governments, and slowly maneuvered to place Soviet-friendly politicians at the top of the three Baltic states who would be more than willing to comply with them. In June of 1940, the Soviets further increased pressure. The Soviets then mobilized troops on the Baltic states' borders. On 14th of June, a demand for Lithuania to establish a Soviet government was made, while Soviet forces blockaded Estonia. On the 15th of June, Soviet troops invaded Lithuania, while Soviet and Latvian troops exchanged fire near Maslanki near the Soviet-Latvian border. The main invasion of Estonia and Latvia began on the next day. Sporadic fighting would continue for days to come, but for the large part the Soviet forces occupied the three countries with relative ease by the end of the day on the 17th of June due to a massive disadvantage in manpower for the Baltic states. In July, plebiscites were held in the three countries to join the Soviets, and all three nations expressed their wish to join the Soviet Union. The elections were widely recognized as fixed, although nobody was willing to do anything about it because they weren't really in a situation to do so. The annexation of the three countries was completed in early August, when Lithuania, then Latvia, and then Estonia joined the Soviet Union. Construction of defenses in the newly annexed states would begin by the end of 1940 due to suspicions of the Germans. Finally, with the three Baltic states now annexed by the Soviet Union, Vyacheslav Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister, asked Germany to recall their ambassador to Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia within the next 2 weeks, and to close the embassies by the 1st of September 1940. After the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the Baltic states were under military occupation by the Germans from 1941 to 1944. Initially, many of the citizens from the Baltic states considered the Germans as liberators from the Soviet Union. In Lithuania, a revolt broke out on the first day of Operation Barbarossa, and a provisional government was established there. As the German armies approached Riga and Tallinn, there were attempts to re-establish national governments, hoping that the Germans would restore partial governance for the three nations. These hopes soon evaporated and Baltic cooperation would soon cease to exist. A growing proportion of the local populations turned against the German regime as they turned the Baltic states except for Memel, which had been annexed into Greater Germany before the Soviet occupation, and most of Belarus into the Reichskommissariat Ostland, which was a colony in all but name, with the local people having basically no say in their so-called nation's politics. Heinrich Lohse, a German politician, was leader, or Reichskommissar, until he fled during Operation Bagration 1944. Furthermore, Nazi Germany rejected the recreation of the Baltic states in any form in the future, as it unilaterally declared itself the successor to all three of the Baltic countries, as well as the Soviet Union, which it expected would collapse due to the German invasion. The Germans immediately spread their anti-Semitic policies into the Baltic states, with them deploying mobile death squads. It was planned that once the Soviets would collapse, two-thirds of the native population would be deported. Although their racial policies were more aimed against the Jews and not so much the majority Baltic peoples. A Holocaust memorial near the site of the HKP slave labor camp in Subashaus Street, Vilnius. The Western Allies simply did not care enough about the Baltic states, as the Baltic states did not have governments in exile as effective as those of the French or Polish, leading them to be forgotten and lost to the Soviet forces. The greatest change the Soviet policy of glasnost made to Soviet culture was the people no longer feared the state. Lithuanian people not only demonstrated but enjoyed their newfound liberty. Demonstrators against the government were often punished severely in the USSR, and throughout the late 80s there was widespread official warnings of violence against the protesters. The Lithuanian people were not deterred, and an estimated 200,000 people risked their lives on that day alone. The demonstration was in the Lithuanian capital Vilnius. This demonstration and the dozens like it were as much a celebration of the Lithuanian people's rebirth of nationalism and pride as a protest against Soviet domination. The mention of Stalin's crimes against Lithuania were suppressed and officially denied up until Gorbachev's appointment to office. Only glasnost allowed the real story of their oppression to become known and openly discussed. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia set an example of rebellion for the rest of the USSR to follow. In 1988, while the rest of the USSR was relatively calm, the Baltic states were in open defiance of the Soviet government. On the 24th of August 1989, half the adult population of the Baltics formed a human chain stretching the entire length of the three republics to protest against the 50th anniversary of Soviet rule. In the parliamentary elections, the Sejudis, a not-so-Soviet-friendly party, swept the board. They were elected to the Supreme Soviet in Moscow, allowing their voices to be heard nationwide through televised coverage. On the 11th of March 1990, by 124 votes to 0 with 6 abstentions, the Lithuanian parliament passed the Act of the Supreme Council on the restoration of the independent Lithuanian state. This shocked the Kremlin, who replied in the only way they knew how. Tanks were sent in on the 22nd of March, and 5 days later Soviet troops occupied strategic buildings. Estonia and Latvia were not far behind, declaring independence on March 30 and May 4 respectively. Economic sanctions were applied but had no effect, just like the military actions before them. The Baltic republics blew a hole in the walls of the Soviet state. They had achieved the unthinkable by use of mere people power, along the way setting an example for the other republics to follow. National fronts were quickly established in most Soviet republics. Lithuania, brought into the USSR by force, had proved it could leave through mass protests and popular support for independence. By the 6th of September 1991 they finally broke free from the 50-year Soviet stranglehold on them. Well, that's the end. I hope you enjoyed this video, so maybe subscribe. Anyways, I know the Holocaust in the Baltic states is controversial, so I've tried to keep it to a limit, and there isn't as much interesting information on the occupation after WW2 before independence, so I mostly left that out. Finally, have a great day and suggest anything else below.